Welcome to Wearing History. Today we're doing the last video for the 1939 wrap dress. You can find the other videos on my channel. This is Wearing History R123. You can find it on wearinghistorypatterns.com and Wearing History on Etsy. The first thing we're going to do is sew the side seams of the waistband. Please notice that I have a seam down my center front. You will not have a seam. I was out of fabric, so I used my scraps to cut my waistbands. You will want to thread mark yours, then mark your notches and your dots. We're going to leave an opening on one side for the tie, so pay attention to your directions and compare it to the illustration. Then you're going to pin and mark your notches and flip to the other side, and there will be some dots marking where you're going to start and stop your stitching. So do one stitch and back stitch, do the other stitch, and then back stitch, and then you press that open. On the other side, this is just one seam, so you don't leave an opening on the other side. Match your notches and sew it all the way across, and press that open. You can see now there's an opening on one side, the other side does not have an opening. So now that we have that done, you're going to be matching this to the center front of your bodice. Remember, yours will not have a seam. You'll probably thread mark yours. We're also going to match the notches and the dots. So do not be alarmed when the side seams of the waistband don't match the side seams of the bodice. If you look at the mock-up video on my channel, I will show that process there more in depth. So match your notches, match your dots, and like I mentioned in the prior video, I extended the back, so the back will have a little bit more overlap as I demonstrate there with my hands. Usually it will end at that dot there, and that's for the low backed version. I show the alteration for how to get more bra coverage, and so mine has a little bit extra there. Now that you've marked those critical points, center front, center back, and the notches, you've got this extra to ease in. So depending on your fabric, you'll want to wiggle this across and smooth it out with your hands as you go so you don't get any tucks or any puckers or anything like that. So go slowly, use as many pins as you need to, and you will pin it across, and then do the same to the other side. After you've done that, you're going to sew it all the way across, and then you're going to press the seam down towards the waistband. When it's done, it looks like this. Now you can see it's going down, and that's what it looks like from the right side. Now we're going to sew the skirt together. So mark all of your notches and your dots, mark your center backs, and your center front is a seam here. So the first thing we're going to do is sew that center front seam, and then press that open. You can see I've done that here. And in a future thing, it'll look like it's serged. So I did that. So make sure you've marked your center back and your notches and all the things you need on your back skirts. And then you're going to match your backs to your fronts. But before that, you are going to finish this flap here to finish that edge. It's about an inch. So you're going to roll that towards the inside and then hand stitch or machine stitch this to place. I chose to do it by hand. My skirt is about 6 inches shorter than the pattern because I ran out of fabric, so make sure that you keep that in mind. If you shorten it like me, it'll be about knee length if you're my height, but if you're on the short side, it could be a little longer. Just try that in your mock-up phase. So I'm turning it under twice, and then I'm stitching that to place. Now you can see my center front is pressed open, and I'm going to start matching my side seams. So there's my finished edges all hand sewn to place. Match them right sides together and then match those side notches together. These edges will not be on straight of grain, but they'll be somewhat on a bias, so you will have to ease the pieces in together slowly and be careful not to pull one more than the other. You'll also want to make your skirt hang for about a day to make sure that it doesn't droop or do anything weird. So I'm pinning this now by hand. You can see that I'm being careful to match my top edges and my notches, and then I kind of wiggle it with my fingers to get the two different grain lines to lay nicely together. Just take your time, and sometimes they won't match exactly at the bottom, and that's okay, but it depends on your fabric when you're cutting it. Some fabrics behave a lot differently than others, but the pattern should be true. So just wiggle it down, play with your fingers, and keep on going. Then stitch that with your 3/8 inch seam allowance and press those seams open. After that's done, you're going to attach the skirt to the waistband. Again, you won't have a center front seam on your waistband, so match that to your stitching for your center front. So match the skirt there, And then you're going to be matching the other markings, which will be the marking for center back. I have a little snip on my skirt there, so I'm matching that to the center back snip on the waistband. And then I'm going to match my notches together. And then there should be a dot that you marked, and that will mark to the edge of the skirt. So see the dot there matches to the edge of the skirt there. Now I'm pinning that across. Near the back there, it won't be so difficult to pin because most of them are on grain. But as you get to the sides, things go a little bit off grain there. So don't pull it too much. Make sure that you just ease those two together, because if you pull on this, it's going to make your waistband bigger. Just really listen to what the fabric wants to do and use your hands and your fingers to smooth things slowly into place and lay them nicely. And again, see, those two seams don't match. This is normal for this pattern. The 30s were kind of experimental with the way that pattern pieces shaped in together, so don't freak out when those two seams don't match. That's how it's supposed to be. As long as your center fronts, center backs, notches, and dots match, you're good to go. So here we go again, notches together, and the edge of the skirt matches to the dot. The center backs match together. I'm pinning across there, and then I'm easing the other side into place. I've sped this up quite a lot because it did take quite a lot of time for me to get it the way I wanted it to be. And you don't want to sit through 10 minutes of me pinning. Now we're doing that seam there. Again, they don't match. That's okay. And ease those in together. Don't pull them. Just make them go nice and flush together. It really pays to have a gentle hand when you're working on this. We're going to seam it all the way across, and then you're going to press it up. So both the top goes down towards the waistband, the bottom goes up towards the waistband, and now we're going to do the facing. So the facing's a little tricky because you're going to be working on the ends first. Match right sides together, and the notches are very important when you're doing this. Notches should match, dots should match on the waistbands. So there's the dot there, there's the dot there, there's the notches there. I'm laying those two dots together, and that's where I'm starting my pinning. Notice they're right sides together. So you will be turning the tie right side out before you sew the side seams of the waistband together. We are not sewing the side seams of the waistband until the tie ends are completely together with the final dress. You'll see what I mean. So now we are easing the two ties together. The ties are cut on the bias, so the end of the tie should be closer to straight of grain, and then you have to ease the two together, which takes a lot of fussing. Just wiggle those pins into place. Use your hands to spread the ties apart because sometimes they'll want to like pull narrower as you're working on the bias. So just ease them back in and flatten them out and make sure that those two edges match correctly together. I find it really helps to start at the center of the piece, and then you see my fingers pushing it out and then pushing it down. So start in the center of the piece and then get the two edges to lay nicely together. And now we're going to stitch it from the dot on one side all the way around across the end and then all the way back to the other dot. After it's done, it looks like this. Now we are going to clip it with our scissors on those corners. I'm going to trim down the extra fabric. I sped this up quite a lot. But yes, you want to trim down the extra fabric so it gets to be about 1/4 of an inch wide. You don't need any extra bulk in here. Be careful when you get to the end not to snip anything that's important. And then you're going to get a loop turner, which is what this is here. You're going to stick it in, grab it with a little hook, and then pull that right side out. You can get these at any normal fabric store or most likely online. I think it's by Dritz. You're going to make sure the points are laying nice, and then you're going to press it. Now that it's pressed, it will look like this. you'll see that there will be the ends there and it's nicely pressed. And now after these two are together, we are going to do the side seams. So you want the side seams of the facing to be towards the inside so it will all be encased. So we're going to be matching these two notches together, right sides together. Be very careful with this step because it's easy to make things mixed up. So match those notches together just like this. After you've pressed the ties and have them the way they're supposed to be, don't do it before or things will end up really wonky. So you're going to match the other side together. And then remember that side opening that I just pointed out in the video. We are going to do the same thing here. We're going to start and then stop our stitching and then start and then stop our stitching so that we have the other side of the opening. So matching those dots and then start and stop, start and stop. The other side is just a straight seam, so you pin it together and you do the straight seam there, and then you press those open. Looks good. Everything matches. Everything looks like you've got right sides facing you, and then you stitch them. After it's done, it looks like that. You can see the opening on the side there. Now we're going to start matching it to place. You're going to match center front of your waistband to center front of the bodice on your stitching there. Then center front of the skirt to center front of the belt right there, turning under about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance so that you encase those seams. You can also give yourself a stitch line here that's 3/8 of an inch before you sew any of this together, and that helps you know where to turn it under. But since this fabric was a little bit wiggly, I wasn't sure that the 3/8 would be accurate, so I just decided to eyeball it here. So I am easing it across. It's always easier at the center fronts because it's more on grain. Now we're going to match the side where it opens. So you're going to turn this and then you're going to lap it right there, being careful to make sure that the opening is in the right spot. And when I went through and hand stitched this, I found I needed to trim down my seam allowance right where that opening was because the seam allowance tended to lap over where the opening was and I didn't want any fraying. So I just snipped it down even smaller of a seam allowance there once everything was stitched together, but before I stitched the opening. So you're going to stitch around the opening to attach those two together. Now I'm just easing it across with my fingers. I'm matching now the center back of the waistband and the center back of the bodice and the center back of the skirt, turning under, and then we've got this bit that's a little bit wiggly because it's more on the bias, so you can see I take out some pins, re-put in some pins, and just ease that all the way across. I did find when I was stitching this waistband to place that I needed to make things a little bit adjusted. So if you find the same thing, don't worry about it. So that you see you sew around the opening like that. When it's all stitched, it looks like this. So that is all hand done and it's to place. The opening is there. Now I'm going to test it and take the belt and stick it through that opening and it will work. So that's how it closes. You insert it through there and then the other side laps over and then you can tie it in a bow in the front. Now don't forget to finish the shoulders. We didn't go over this in the last video. You're going to top stitch about 3/8 of an inch from the seam line. Now we're going to finish the armholes. I've made self-made bias for this. You can find other tutorials online. I don't think I have any at this time for how to make your own bias. I did notice that the underarm in front really wanted to stretch out when it was on me because this fabric was so soft. So I decided to stay stitch before I even attached my bias. That's what I just did at about a 1/4 inch. The seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch, so I know that I've got about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on the self-made bias. So I'm lapping this just on the other side of that 1/4 inch stitch line, and I know that that's going to make it so that you won't see that stay stitch line. You don't need to stay stitch your armhole, but I just found it helpful with my particular fabric because it was so pliant. So you see I'm folding it up and down and comparing it and then making sure my new stitch line is going to cover that old stitch line so it won't be visible. After this, I've sewn it and now I am trimming away the extra down to about 1/4 inch. And when you match your bias to your armhole, you do it right sides together. And now you see I'm going to turn it, and then I'm going to hand stitch that to place. I didn't show that, but this is what it's like when it's all finished. If you need more bias tutorials, you can find those on wearinghistoryblog.com. I really hope you enjoyed sewing this dress with me. Please follow me for more tutorials and more future sewing projects. You can find my Patterns Wearing History on Etsy and wearinghistorypatterns.com. Happy sewing!